have to learn.
Now, in the same line, Mr. Samarisinghe, the Minister, has also said very recently, again reiterated the fact that it was a former general's statements that actually drew a lot of attention and to the level that it also sort of went into where the Secretary General had to come up with a probe, so to say, about the war crimes. But when there's one school of thought to that effect, there is another school of thought which says that actually, it is not the statements of the former general per se that attracted international attention, and just because a former general or a military officer, even if the person was in office, just made arbitrary statements like that with respect to war crimes, they are of the opinion that it is not matter, or it shouldn't be a concern for prosecution of the particular person who made those comments. And if that is happening, that is, if there's prosecution, and if how the state reacts to that sort of statements is what actually will attract a lot of international attention to the incident, and not the statements per se, because in many other parts of the world also there are military officers involved in war and conflict who has made such statements. But by the state reacting in such a way and going into prosecution, you actually highlight an event saying that these military secrets were revealed and making the spotlight on the whole event. So that is one school of thought. So what are your comments on that, Professor?
Well, I don't think Sarath Fonseca was revealing military secrets at all. The man was just saying what came into his head depending on what audience he was playing to. So that, for instance, in this American State Department report, I think the most serious thing is the Americans quote Lanka Newsweb, Mangala Samaravaira's Newsweb. Those were the days when Mangala Samaravaira saw Sarath Fonseca as the enemy. It quotes him as saying, and the person who ordered the white flags, because people in air-conditioned rooms sort of said, don't shoot, and we decided to shoot because I know what to do. So he was now playing to one audience. 6 months later, he was reported by Frederica Jans in the Sunday Leader as having said something else. So I think the man was obviously just playing for political advantage. There has never been any question of the government prosecuting him for anything he said. I mean, that's all nonsense. Government has pointed out how foolish he was and how ridiculous this was, because other people who are as excitable and emotional as Sarath Fonseca also react, and that's bad for the country. But no one's prosecuting him for that. What he's being prosecuted for is his crimes. I mean, I'm not saying he's guilty, but one is the politicking, which you don't do as an army officer, and it really has been pretty bad. But even more seriously, to my mind, is the evidence of corruption. And those are what he's being prosecuted for. I mean, shooting his mouth off, any idiot can do. Sarath Selva has just done it. No one's going to prosecute him for talking nonsense.
And the same school of thought, Professor, they are also of the opinion that actually that Sri Lanka is a sort of a hellhole when it comes to human rights, and there are unprecedented human rights violations that are taking place. And actually it is with the help of the West, maybe, that we can actually get the country back to normal and restore normalcy. That is one school of thought, as you know. And
I don't know that school of thought. Who are the people who have that school of thought?
That is, they believe that
Sri Lankans or foreigners?
It is the Sri Lankans, and also there are many activists and journalists as well.
I don't think anyone believes that. I think there are people who want to take political advantage of a situation, who want to make a noise in order to help the opposition win, or rather, more sadly, in order to make the government lose. I think the most obvious example that they don't believe a word of what they say is how the so-called human rights activists ended up asking people to vote for Sarath Fonseca. I mean, it's just madness. Eh? I mean, they are not idiots. They knew his record. They knew what they were saying about him earlier. I know that at one point in the past, on certain statements, someone will come and say, this is what your government believes. I say, this is not what the government believes. And they say, oh, but your army commander says so. And I said, well, the army commander is entitled to his point of view. You know, we never let him down. But he said, that is not government policy. Expanding the army by 100,000, the country belonging to the majority, the politicians in Tamil Nadu being nutcases. You know, he's an individual who used to like to shoot his mouth off occasionally, provocatively. Sometimes I think even his statement on this, the second statement, was just provocation to upset the apple cart. Because, you know, that was the stage, if you remember, when the United States Senate had come out with a positive report. And I think we should have engaged with them, because there are some sane people in America who I think realized that we did more sanely and in a more civilized fashion our battle against terror than they poor chaps have been able to do. So Sarath Fonseca upsets apple carts. I mean, that's his nature.
So, do you mean to say that when it comes to the human rights track record in Sri Lanka, I think some of the activists, some of the journalists, some of the also Tamil community and also the diaspora, the base they go on is the fact that there are human rights violations that are taking place, and the efforts with respect to reconciliation is also not up to the standard, up to the point it should happen, and they are of the opinion that it is the INGOs and the NGOs and also the Western countries actually that will support Sri Lanka come back into track. Now this is very different from the other school of thought who basically demonizes the others and say that the West has an imperialistic strategy where it is sort of gunning down Sri Lanka. So those are the two school of thoughts actually that is there. So on that note, Professor, what are your comments on that?
Well, I always think that seeing things in absolutes is nonsense, because that's not the way the world runs. When we talk about countries, countries consist of individuals. When we talk of NGOs, there are different NGOs. For instance, I have always stood up for the way in which certain institutions like the Civil Rights Movement of Sri Lanka, which has a superb record of talking about errors of all governments. They've been critical of this government, but they've never done it in a "you did it" type of thing. They said, here is a problem, please solve it. I also accept for a few mad people in amnesty, but we've identified them. There are people like the cluster bomb specialist, but some people like Irene Khan have been pretty decent. I always think the university teachers for human rights, I mean, they get things wrong, but they are sincere. I have always made, let me put it this way, a distinction between people who raise issues which must be raised and those who raise it in a spirit of, I know who did the wrong thing, it was all done by people in government at the moment, which is nonsense. Now they're now having to eat their words on various institutions. These are the same people who flocked to Sarath Fonseca's banner. Why? It was sheer pettiness and, a feeling that they didn't like a government that didn't take them seriously. So there are things like human rights groups which are trying to work towards human rights, and those are the ones who point out that we have got problems, we ought to make them better, but who distinguish those from our war against terror. And I think we had to fight terrorism. I think this government did a fantastic job about it. And let's be honest, Sarath Fonseca as army commander, working under the civilian commanders and with fantastic younger staff who did the fighting, also did a good job himself. But I think it was the government that managed to do it while also maintaining standards, which, as I told you, Sarath Fonseca in August thought were unnecessary, when he dismissed derogatorily people in air-conditioned rooms who were asking him to spare people in white flags. That's what he claimed. So, we have to recognize that our war against terror was one of the cleanest in the world. But that doesn't mean that our record on human rights is perfect. The murder of Lasantha Wickramatunge was an obvious case in point. I think we all had to agree that was wrong. And if, people try to justify it, that is not correct. We have to make it absolutely clear that these things must be looked at. Of course, one of the points we've always made is that our police were overstretched. They did a great job under difficult circumstances, but they had to do 100 different jobs at the same time. Now, I think with the terrorism we hope over, and I hope no one tries to revive it, including those mad foreign governments who are encouraging the diaspora to go back to terrorism. I think, they may not think they're doing it, but obviously that's what they're doing. We all know that. So long as we don't have terror again, I think the police will go back, I hope, to being a well-trained professional force with time for the training that they haven't had in the last few years.
So now the investigations for Lasantha is being carried out, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it should be.
And also when you talk about human rights record, as you said, it's not definitely perfect.
Yeah.
Now, when we were fighting the war, it was a different paradigm altogether. Now it's a post-war situation. So the countries who supported us at that time, who was with us at that time, will not be in the same way. They will not continue to be with us after the in the post-war context as well. So that actually seeks for a very strong role when it comes to human rights and the independence, and also the teeth of institutions that are that concerns human rights. So what is your comment and your opinion